where we sit back as evaluators and be like, man, that guy's the number one guy. I'm kind of disappointed thus far.
What's going on, everybody? Draft Network's Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino, Damian Parson, and Keith Sanchez here to talk about our latest TDN 100 update. And of course, these conversations have to start with the quarterback position. It's the money position in the NFL draft. We've had a chance to watch a couple of games for each of the prominent quarterbacks eligible for 2023, and we've updated our ballots. So I'm going to throw an open question out here to the crew. What quarterback performance through the first month of the season, approximately, has moved the needle for you guys the most? Whether that's a confirmation of what you thought you knew about somebody, or somebody showing something different that you didn't quite know you were going to get.
Well, what stands out to me, Kyle, is CJ Stroud. And not that it's any one performance that he's had, but it's the collection of all of them to this point. And what excites me is when I contrast it to last year, we weren't that excited about CJ Stroud early on. You saw the skill, but it was pretty uneven in terms of his ability to step in and operate in that offense. This year, he's hit the ground running. And what's impressive to me about that is he's done it without necessarily the receivers being consistent around him. I know Marvin Harrison's really made a lot of plays, but Jackson Smith and Jigba was supposed to be that guy. He's been banged up. His production's been very minimal so far this season. Julian Fleming, another player that's kind of been slow to get going. And so I think for me, it's not necessarily any one performance, but it's what CJ Stroud has done early in the season to hit the ground running and do so without necessarily the pieces he expected to be around him in place.
Agreed, Joe. And that's because I was going to say CJ Stroud as well. You look at the past two games, right? The first game one against Notre Dame, you lose Jackson Smith and Jigba early, and the offense just didn't look the same. The rhythm with the other receivers just wasn't there. The next two games, he's thrown over 700 yards, 9 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. And specifically against Toledo, he looked so dialed in, so locked in. The accuracy, the ball placement, the control of the offense. He just looked like a guy on a mission to prove he's the best quarterback in college football.
Yeah, for me, I have to be completely honest. I don't know, right? At the end of the day, like through 3 to 4 games of this season, right, we've gotten some pretty lackluster performances. Let's be honest, like a quarterback class that we were extremely excited about. I know, Joe, you talked about CJ Stroud hit the ground running. He kind of stumbled a little bit against Notre Dame, right? And then I would say the past 2 weeks he picked up Bryce Young, right, against the Texas game. That looked okay. Like, thankfully he was able to pull it out at the end. But I think right now where I'm with this quarterback class is like, I still want to see more, right? Like some of the same question marks I had coming into the season, I kind of still have now, right? Like my guy, Will Levis, I know he's athletic and he showcased that against Florida in a game that he took over, right? Like he had to make 2 or 3 plays to where he had to win the game, and he won the game. So I would say this: Will Levis moved up the board for me some, just as far as from a toughness standpoint and knowing that the tools are definitely transferable. But as far as just pure quarterback performances where we sit back as evaluators and be like, man, that guy's the number one guy, I'm kind of disappointed thus far, I'll say, just in the quarterback discussion overall.
Yeah, I think that the race for QB1 is still very much wide open. To the first point with CJ Stroud, what's a fun fact about him is he's everybody's QB2, but he's slotted one spot immediately behind who everybody's QB1 is. So, Joe, you and I, Will Levis, you have him 6th, I have him 5th. Well, you have Stroud 7th, and I have Stroud 6th. For Keith, Bryce Young, 1st, 3rd overall. CJ Stroud, 4th overall, right behind him. Dame, Bryce Young, 6th overall. CJ Stroud, right behind him at 7th overall. And even Brentley has Bryce Young 6 and Stroud 7. It's the consistency for Stroud that has him as the consensus number 1 quarterback right now, while still not being anybody's actual QB1 on their individual TDN 100 ballot. But Keith, I'm glad you mentioned the toughness from Will Levis in that Florida game. I think that is a performance on the road against a really good defensive front that you can't help but respect and tip your cap to the fact that Levis on a couple of occasions got lit up as the right side of that offensive line, particularly at offensive tackle, both in the run game, QB run game and in pass protection. There have been lapses there, and you've seen the impact that Brenton Cox brought to that football game against the Gators. So I definitely respected the toughness performance from Will Levis in that football game. But then the clutch performance of Bryce Young in that Texas game, like you mentioned, Keith, that ability in crunch time late in the game to be able to string plays together when you hadn't been able to do it all night long against Texas. That performance to me was another one, was gutsy for different reasons.
Yeah.
And I think those are the two individual game performances that I look at to this point in the season, and I think have helped those players' individual narratives. But my next question for you guys is this. As you look at the guys that are on the TDN 100 and quarterbacks that made the cut, Stroud, Young, Levis, Richardson, Van Dyke, Tanner McKee, who are we most concerned about? Who's the name when you look at this and you're saying, hey, we knew there was upside to buy into here, but at the same time, this is no slam dunk that this player would be a top 100 pick, should declare for this upcoming draft. What name pops the most to each one of you guys?
Oh, it's got to be Anthony Richardson from Florida. And it's funny because if he didn't have the next two games, the way I would have answered the question originally in terms of which quarterback performance was the most impressive, I'd have said Anthony Richardson against Utah.
Right.
But then the next 2 weeks happened, and he didn't replicate that, and we saw some warts in his game and some inconsistency putting the right weight on the ball and some aversion to running the football and just maybe some offensive architecture type issues. And so he's really cooled after that first game, and you start to think about, okay, well, he didn't have a ton of experience coming into this. He had one good game against Utah, 2 down games against Kentucky and USF. What trajectory is he on? Is this a player we should be taking seriously as a guy for this year's class? Or is it pretty obvious that he needs more time to mature and develop and showcase more of what he is? I mean, the skill is undeniable. He's got size, arm talent, mobility. You can watch 10 plays and realize that. But what type of actual refined quarterback is he when we're starting to talk about asking him to play on Sundays? And right now, through a very small sample size, I think we're left with more questions than answers.
I agree with Joe. A-Rich has been rough these past 2 weeks, but I want to pivot to Tanner McKee. Watching him being the 6'6", tall, long-legged, high-hip quarterback, he doesn't offer mobility. He's not a guy that can move the launch point much. He's not going to make the first guy miss and extend plays. And if the pocket is not clean, neither are his passes. And just the way he performed against USC gave me a lot of concern. I think he threw 2 interceptions. I think it was like 57% completion. And it's not like this offense doesn't have viable weapons. You have Elijah Higgins. You have Ben Yorsick at tight end, and E.J. Smith, the Hall of Fame, the son of Hall of Fame running back Emmitt Smith. He has some weapons. The offensive line is solid. It's just, for me, the throwing motion. They now have the deep mesh RPO that they've implemented. That I don't really know how that helps him or works with his body type from a composition standpoint and from a suddenness and twitchiness in the hips. I do have concerns, man. Because you talk about Anthony Richardson, McKee struggled with ball speed and altering speeds, especially down the field, to take advantage when his guys are able to get open. So I think for me, the jury is still out on Tanner McKee right now.
Yeah, and if we're talking about a quarterback with a missed opportunity, how about Tyler Van Dyke, right, against Texas A&M? Appalachian State just beat this team, right? So, you have them on the ropes, and if Appalachian State is able to stay in that game as a Sun Belt team, then Miami, you have to feel pretty good about knowing that we match up well as far as athletes. And watching the film, Kyle, I know we both watched him, evaluate him, and there were things that we really liked about him, right? And I'm like, okay, if Van Dyke can, get in the pocket, sit in the pocket, and deliver some accurate passes, he'll be okay. Like, they should be able to at least put up 20, 25, 30 points, but that didn't happen Saturday. And he looked, fairly shook. So that was a performance that I had highlighted. I'm like, okay, this may be an opportunity where Tyler Van Dyke can, if Anthony Richardson falls out of that top 4, Van Dyke has the opportunity to slide into that 4th position. But man, it was just a missed opportunity overall for Van Dyke.
Man, great minds thinking alike here, Keith. Van Dyke was the name for me. Where, just look at the schedule they played: Bethune-Cookman, Southern Miss, and Texas A&M.
Yeah.
Right, and this was an early schedule, the first couple of games, to make sure that you were finely tuned. You get to go to College Station, you play at Kyle Field, and you really had a showcase that was against a lot of NFL talent on the other side of the ball. And for context purposes, yeah, they played without their number one wide receiver in this football game. But at the same time, 51% completion. Keith, you mentioned the lack of comfort that I thought he showed on the field, and I saw the same thing. So in the midst of Anthony Richardson not sustaining his play week over week after teams kind of got an idea on offensively, oh, okay, here's what Florida's doing with Anthony Richardson. You were thinking, okay, who's the next name that can kind of inject themselves into that conversation? And logically, Van Dyke was the next name on the list, and I don't think he's done anything to help himself. And because of that, now you start thinking about getting into ACC play. And this offense has a lot of impact players at the skill positions, but they're running backs and tight ends. And I think one of the limiting factors for a lot of these guys, where you look at Kentucky and you look at Florida, the ability of the guys around these quarterbacks to help them make plays with the ball in their hands, I think is going to be an ongoing storyline. Who can find some guys that can help make life easier for them? And that may, in part, be a kind of a storyline in the peripheral that helps decide how this all shakes out when it is all said and done. The last thing I wanted to ask everybody is, as we move forward and we shift our focus to October and November, what's something you guys are looking for or hoping to see from any of the quarterbacks that either made the cut for the second edition of the TDN 100 or have not yet made the cut for the TDN 100?
I want to see how Bryce Young turns it on. You know, I think there's been some adjustments with some new weapons around him this year, and even Tyler Harrell hasn't really been available for him. I want to see how this passing game really takes off with a quarterback like Bryce, but with more time with those weapons. And obviously we saw what he can do last year and how that really took off with McKee and Jamison Williams. Well, it's a new cast of characters around him, and, you know, conference plays coming, expectations are high. I'm really excited to see how Bryce Young really evolves as this season moves along.
Yeah, I want to stick with Stroud. I want to see if the last two games, if this type of production, if he continues this, you know what I mean? Like, we get into the Big Ten play and conference play against some good defenses in the Big Ten. That's one thing we know about them. They can produce good defenses. Offensively, maybe not so much, but they can give him defense that can test him. And if he can continue this level of play, man, that QB1 discussion may tip the scale in CJ Stroud's favor.
Yeah, that's why I'm at too. I'm with CJ Stroud on, wanting to see more from him, or just see him take his game to the next level. And it's because the QB1 is definitely in discussion, right? Like you said, Kyle, he's number 2 for all of us, right? So I think it's a matter of one thing that he's missing, and this guy will be the consensus number 1 overall quarterback. So I want to see him really continue to mature with those young wide receivers, right? Like, outside of Jackson Smith and Jigba, I want him to see him take control of this offense, be the guy, and then really showcase that, you know what, like, I can be the number 1 overall pick because I can be the leader of an entire franchise.
I'm going to invoke 2 names here that I'm hoping to see maybe make a jump and get into this conversation for TDN 100, and it's Will Rogers from Mississippi State, and it's Aiden O'Connell from Purdue. I think these are 2 guys who, statistically speaking, have been highly productive players. We just saw Purdue go up and lose a football game against Syracuse by a narrow margin, but O'Connell down the stretch, after making a tough decision for a pick six, he was in the grasp of a defensive lineman, then in turn made a lot of nice throws there to kind of lift Purdue back into contention before the defense broke on them on the final possession of the football game. So I'm interested to see what those guys can do to build on early non-conference performances to potentially parlay their way into at least getting into the top 100 conversation. I certainly don't expect Will Rogers or Aiden O'Connell to get into the first round conversation, but there is a market for day 2 quarterbacks. And I think those guys have shown some tools and arm talent while still working in different kinds of offenses that they can make this thing interesting a little bit. So that's what I am looking forward to seeing as we shift gears, and we're going to shift gears and continue to work our way through all of the updates that you need to know for the latest edition of the TDN 100. So make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, get the notifications, click on the bell, and that way you'll know when all of our latest drops and updates go live, and visit thedraftnetwork.com to see the full list of the latest TDN 100 and catch up on everything you need to know this football season.